There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got. It's the exhaustion of being the person everyone calls when something goes wrong, and almost no one calls just to ask how you're doing. It's answering the phone at 11 at night for someone else's emergency and realizing, somewhere in the middle of calmly talking them through it, that no one has asked you that question in longer than you can remember. You're good in a crisis, everyone says so. What almost no one says is what that's been quietly costing you for years, while it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Maybe it started small. A friend going through something hard and you being the one who stayed on the phone until 2 a.m. because you could and because it felt important that you did. Then it was a sibling's divorce, then a parent's health scare where you were the one everyone looked to for the next decision. Each time you showed up because that's what showing up looks like, and because the alternative, not showing up, never actually felt like an option, even when it would have been reasonable. Nobody forced any of this on you. That's part of what makes it so hard to talk about. It doesn't look like a burden from the outside. It looks like generosity, and generosity isn't supposed to need defending. Carl Jung wrote about a principle he borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, called enantiodromia, the tendency for equality, pushed far enough in one direction to eventually produce its opposite. Applied to a person, the idea is this. If one part of you, say the part that's capable, dependable, unshakable, is the only part that ever gets to show up, the other part doesn't disappear. It doesn't get weaker from disuse. It builds quietly in the background with nowhere to go. And eventually, often without warning, it finds a way through. As sudden exhaustion, as a small thing triggering a disproportionately large reaction, as a kind of collapse that seems to come out of nowhere to everyone watching, including, often, the person it's happening to. This is the trajectory of the strong one, not a steady line that continues forever, a line that bends eventually toward whatever's been left out of it for too long. From the outside, this can look like nothing is happening for a very long time. The strong one keeps being strong. The capable one keeps being capable. Years can pass this way, and to everyone watching, the pattern looks not just stable, but proof. Proof that this person simply doesn't need what other people need, that they're built differently, that the role fits because it's true. What enantiodromia describes is that this apparent stability isn't the absence of pressure, it's pressure being stored. The bend, when it comes, often looks sudden to everyone who only ever saw the stable part, but it was never sudden. It was the part that had been missing the entire time, finally finding its way back into the picture, usually at a moment nobody would have chosen. Number 1, the persona that can't afford to crack. The persona, for Jung, was the mask shaped by what a person learned the world needed from them. And for the strong one, that mask isn't just a preference. It often feels load-bearing, like the people around you are, in some sense, leaning on it. Daniel was the oldest of 4 siblings and had been the one everyone turned to since he was a teenager. First for his younger siblings, later for his parents, eventually for friends, then colleagues. He worked in healthcare, which only reinforced the pattern. He was good at staying calm when things went wrong, good at being the person who didn't panic. People trusted him with the hard moments precisely because he never seemed to need anything in return. What Daniel didn't talk about, what he never really had language for, was that the role had stopped feeling like something he did a long time ago. It had become something he was. And the two things feel completely different from the inside. One is a role you can put down. The other is an identity you'd have to dismantle. And dismantling an identity feels less like relief and more like disappearing. Daniel could point to the exact period when the shift happened. Looking back, not a single event, but a stretch of a few years in his mid-20s where being the reliable one went from being something he did in specific situations to something people simply assumed about him, automatically. The way you'd assume someone's eye color, once that assumption sets in, it rarely gets revisited. Nobody sits down and decides going forward that Daniel will be the one who handles things. It just becomes the water everyone's swimming in, including Daniel, who stopped being able to remember a version of any relationship in his life where this wasn't already true. Even Daniel's closest relationships operated on this assumption without anyone meaning any harm by it. His partner, his friends, none of them were unkind. None of them were users. They simply had no reason to ask whether Daniel was okay because Daniel never gave them one. Asking implies the possibility of a different answer, and for years there had only ever been one answer available. If this is familiar, start noticing, gently, the moments where being needed and being yourself feel like the same thing. Not to change anything yet, just to see how often that overlap actually happens. Number 2. The complex that says being needed equals being safe. Jung used the term complex to describe an emotionally charged cluster of memories, feelings, and associations that forms early, often in childhood, and continues operating with a kind of independence, influencing behavior in ways the person isn't fully aware of. For many people who become the strong one, there's a complex underneath it that formed long before adulthood. Somewhere, early on, being needed and being safe, or being needed and being loved, got linked together. Maybe it was a household where things felt precarious unless someone stepped up. Maybe it was simply that being helpful was the version of you that got noticed while other versions didn't. Either way, the link forms quietly and it doesn't ask permission before it starts running. Sarah grew up the eldest child of a parent who struggled with their own stress, and from a young age, Sarah learned to read the room before anyone asked her to. Soothing arguments, managing moods, making sure things felt okay even when they weren't. By the time she reached adulthood, this had become entirely automatic. At work, she was the one who absorbed extra tasks no one else wanted, the one managers relied on to just handle it. She wasn't being taken advantage of exactly. She genuinely offered every time. It simply never occurred to her that there was another option. The complex wasn't asking her to consider one. What made it hard for Sarah to see this pattern was that it never looked like a pattern from the inside. It looked like a series of unrelated, reasonable decisions. This project needed someone to step up, so she did. This colleague was overwhelmed, so she covered for them. Each individual, yes, made sense entirely on its own terms. It was only when Sarah, at a friend's suggestion, tried writing down everything she'd taken on in a single month, not to complain, just as an experiment, that she saw it laid out for the first time. A list long enough that she didn't recognize it as her own life until she counted the items. The complex doesn't announce itself as a pattern. It only ever shows up one decision at a time, each one small enough to seem like nothing. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from this. Not the fatigue of doing too much exactly, though that's part of it. It's the fatigue of never having been asked, of going through an entire month, by Sarah's own count, without a single person checking whether she had the capacity for what they were about to ask of her. Not because they didn't care, because the question had simply never occurred to anyone, including, for a long time, Sarah herself. This isn't something to solve by force of will in a single afternoon, but it can help simply to notice when "I'll handle it" arrives before you've actually asked yourself whether you have the capacity to. That gap between the offer and the actual check-in is where the complex is doing the talking. Number 3. The shadow that holds the need you stopped voicing. Jung wrote in his memoir, "How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. For the strong one, the shadow rarely holds anything dramatic. It usually holds something almost embarrassingly ordinary. I need help too. I'm tired too. I don't actually have this handled. Not really, not all the time. These aren't shameful thoughts, but for someone whose entire role depends on not having them, or at least not voicing them, they get pushed out of sight the same way anything does when there's no safe place for it. And like anything in the shadow, they don't go quiet. They show up sideways, as irritability that seems to come from nowhere, as a wave of emotion over something minor that clearly isn't really about the minor thing, as a strange experience of crying at something small while the actual large things in your life remain, on the surface, completely fine. Daniel described once breaking down, briefly, privately, over a TV commercial. Nothing else was wrong that day. Nothing had changed. It just happened to be the one moment in a long stretch of holding everything together where something finally found a crack small enough to get through. What Daniel found hardest to talk about wasn't the crying itself. It was what happened immediately afterward. Within minutes, he felt embarrassed, slightly alarmed at himself, and quietly relieved that no one had been there to see it. He didn't examine it. He didn't connect it to anything. He simply filed it under "that was strange" and went back to his evening. The same way he'd gone back to normal after every other small crack over the years. It was only much later, naming the pattern out loud for the first time, that he realized how many of these moments there had been, and how consistently he treated each one as an isolated, slightly embarrassing glitch rather than as the same message, arriving again and again in a slightly different shape each time. That's not a malfunction. That's the shadow finding an exit. If something like that has happened to you, a disproportionate reaction to something small, it might be worth asking, not what's wrong with me, but what's actually been building that this just happened to let out. Number 4, individuation and holding both at once. Jung's idea of individuation wasn't about choosing between the strong part of yourself and the part that needs things. It was about both being allowed to exist in the same person without either one having to disappear for the other to be acceptable. He also wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. The compulsive strength, the inability to ever be the one who needs something, isn't really strength in the way it gets described. It's often a substitute for a much simpler, more legitimate thing, the ordinary human experience of sometimes needing to be carried, which never got to happen when it should have, and so got replaced with a permanent unwillingness to need it from anyone, ever. It's worth being precise about what legitimate suffering means here, because it isn't a small idea. It means the ordinary, unglamorous experience of being a person who sometimes runs out of energy, out of answers, out of the ability to hold it together for one more day. That experience isn't a failure to be strong. It's simply what being a person includes for everyone, including the people who never show it. The substitute, the permanent strength, the compulsive capability doesn't make that experience go away. It just makes sure no one, including the person living it, ever has to witness it happening. This doesn't mean the strength is fake or that it should be discarded. It means it was never supposed to be the only thing. Individuation, here, looks less like becoming someone new and more like making room for the first time, for the part of you that's been waiting, quietly, this entire time, to be allowed to exist too. This is where the idea of individuation actually becomes useful, rather than just comforting. It doesn't ask Daniel or Sarah or anyone like them to stop being capable, or to start saying no to everything, or to dismantle a role that, in many ways, has served them and the people around them well. What it asks is smaller and in some ways harder, that the capability stop being the entry fee for being acceptable. That needing something occasionally stop requiring an apology, an explanation, or a crisis large enough to justify it. The strength doesn't have to go anywhere, it just stops being the only seat at the table. If any of this sounds like your life, being the one everyone calls, the TV commercial that hit harder than it should have, the offer to help that arrived before you checked whether you had anything left to give, it might be worth asking yourself one question tonight. The last time something was genuinely hard for you, who did you call? And if the honest answer is no one, that's not a failing. That's just the shape of the role as it's existed until now. There's no clean before and after here. No moment where someone stops being the one everyone calls and starts being the one who gets called instead. What usually changes first is much smaller. A single moment, so once, where instead of saying, "I've got it," the truth, "Actually, I don't, not today," gets said out loud to one person and the room doesn't end. Nothing collapses, nobody leaves. It just turns out the role was never as load-bearing as it felt. If you've ever been the strong one for so long that you forgot anyone could be that for you too, tell us about it. When did you first notice the cost, and what was the moment that finally made it visible?